Step aside, sweetheart. Real soldiers are trying to work here. Staff Sergeant Nolan Creed didn't wait for any reaction as his shoulder slammed into her, sending the paper cup spinning from her hand, the splash of brown coffee bursting across the Ironwood Garrison checkpoint like a stain that would never really fade. He saw only a woman in wrinkled civilian clothes, a nobody, maybe some contractor's wife who'd wandered too close to where operators moved. He didn't see her hands that had held a dying man's intestines inside his body for 47 minutes in a tunnel deep under the Corzine Ridge. While she'd called in coordinates for an airstrike on her own position, he never noticed the stillness in her posture, the balanced weight of someone who'd learned to wait for hours without twitching because a single wrong motion meant death. And he would never have believed that this same woman had once made the choice that saved his own life during a mission he never knew existed in a country he was never told he had entered. Her name was Captain Raina Calloway, Military Intelligence. 18 months in a special access program so classified that even her mother believed she'd been stationed in Valdenrake. She watched her coffee seep into the concrete and didn't say a word. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was patience. Because somewhere on this base, a man named Staff Sergeant Damon Rourke was eating breakfast, scrolling his phone, living like he hadn't sold the coordinates that killed 4 of her teammates in a valley erased from every map. She had hunted him for 2 years, and now the chase was ending. The morning fog pressed against Ironwood Garrison like something alive, unwilling to loosen its grip. November in the Redstone territory carried a cold Raina had almost forgotten after years spent in places where cold meant something entirely different. This was a wet chill, heavy with pine forest moisture that mixed with the red clay mud clinging to everything it touched. The kind of weather that made old wounds throb and old memories surface whether you wanted them or not. She stood unmoving outside the headquarters of the 3rd Special Operations Group, watching the base slowly wake through the gray haze. 31 years old and looking like someone who'd lived 3 lifetimes in places designed to break the unprepared. Not old, exactly, just weathered in ways that had nothing to do with sun or wind. Her dark auburn hair was pulled into a regulation knot, revealing sharp facial angles that hadn't smiled for a photo in years. She stood 5'7", lean and hard from hauling rucksacks across terrain that didn't care if she survived, shaped by the truth that extra weight meant slower movement, and slower movement meant death. If you're watching from anywhere in the world right now, feel free to drop your location in the comments, and if this story hits you, consider subscribing to the Major Tom's Tales community, people who believe the quiet ones deserve their stories finally heard. But what truly unsettled people were her eyes. Pale green, unmoving, holding the kind of patience carved from endless hours spent in hidden observation posts, watching compounds for days without shifting, waiting for tiny patterns that would decide whether someone lived or died. Colonel Everett Hale studied her from his second-floor office window. 54 years old, seasoned by combat tours across Iraq, Syria, and far beyond, he'd seen enough men and women come through his command to know the ones who carried weight that couldn't be measured on a scale. Not dangerous in the loud way that frightened amateurs, dangerous in the way that mattered. The kind who could step into impossible situations and somehow return, dragging everyone else with them. He had read her file, the real file, not the harmless version floating through normal systems that listed a military intelligence captain with bland training and liaison roles, but the one requiring an SAP clearance and a signature from someone in JSOC whose name remained blacked out even in internal documents. 18 months in a program that pulled from every special operations pipeline, taking people who were already exceptional and pushing them until only those who could operate completely alone were left standing. 7 deployments to places that didn't officially exist. A combat record that would have earned an entire row of medals if any of it could ever be acknowledged, and a final mission that ended her field career and delivered her to this base, to this moment. She touched her left side without thinking, fingers brushing the spot beneath her uniform where the ink lay hidden, so subtle most people would never notice. Hale wasn't most people. He knew exactly what those small letters marked on her skin represented. 4 names. 4 ghosts. Marcus Reyes. William Chen. David Kowalski. James Whitehorse. Men killed in a valley the government insisted was nowhere. Men betrayed by intelligence someone on this base had sold. Men Raina Calloway had spent 2 relentless years avenging. Raina had learned to shoot long before she learned to ride a bike, and patience came even earlier. Her father, Samuel Calloway, an 18-year veteran of the 75th Ranger Regiment, had returned to their modest farm in the Redstone Territory after a training accident shattered his left knee and ended his operational life. He came home with a limp he never complained about, a combat infantryman's badge he never talked about, and a certainty that his daughter needed to understand the difference between real strength and the noise of people pretending they had it. She was 7 the first time he placed a rifle in her hands, a Ruger 10-22 small enough for her grip but serious enough to demand respect. He never framed shooting as a hobby. To him it was a language, the language of distance and stillness, of knowing exactly when to act and when to wait. By 12, she could place 5 rounds into a 2-inch circle at 200 yards. By 16, that circle had tightened to a single inch, and she no longer thought about the mechanics at all, her body simply executed what her mind no longer needed to analyze. But what her father had given her wasn't just precision. It was quiet. The ability to silence every bit of noise inside her skull until only the necessary remained, the ability to wait through discomfort, fear, and doubt until the exact moment action mattered, and then move without the slightest hesitation because hesitation cost lives. She enlisted the day after she turned 18 and earned her commission through OCS 3 years later, choosing military intelligence because she knew real battles were often won long before the first trigger was ever pulled. By 27, she had been recruited into a special access program that pulled operators from Delta, DevGru, the Activity, and several units whose names were never spoken aloud. They selected people who were already the best and stripped them down even further, pushing until only those who could operate entirely alone in places where capture meant torture and failure meant war remained. The operation that changed everything hit 2.5 years ago, an unnamed mission inserted into a denied zone near the Corzine Ridge to identify and confirm a high-value target tied to the deaths of 17 American service members over 3 years. 8 operators went in by helicopter, dropped into terrain so hostile that if exfil fell apart, they'd have 60 kilometers of unforgiving ground to walk to reach a recovery point. The intelligence package looked solid. The OPSEC was airtight. 48 hours in, 48 out, no direct action unless absolutely necessary. Simple eyes-on confirmation. Nothing went the way it was supposed to. 11 hours after insertion, they were ambushed inside a valley so tight the only cover was the rocks they'd used to hide. Someone had talked. Someone had sold their insertion point, their route, their timing, everything. The firefight raged for 3 hours. When it ended, 4 of her teammates were dead, and 2 were so badly wounded that carrying them out nearly killed everyone left standing. She remembered the thick smell of blood and cordite mingling with the thin mountain air. She remembered the sound Marcus Reyes made when the round tore through his throat, not a scream, just a horrible wet gasp as his hands grabbed for what was gone. She remembered hauling William Chin across her shoulders for the last 2 kilometers while her legs shook and her lungs burned, and the voice in her head whispered that she could rest if she just set him down for a second. She didn't set him down. She carried him to the helicopter, lifted him aboard, held his hand while the medic worked, and felt his eyes lose their focus somewhere above the ridge. The investigation vanished instantly behind classified walls she couldn't penetrate, buried under so much secrecy it might as well have never occurred. They medically removed her from the program, officially for psychological evaluation after combat trauma, unofficially because she wouldn't stop demanding answers about who had betrayed them. For 18 months, she hunted through everything she could access, every contact, every rumor whispered through the special operations community. 6 weeks ago, she finally caught the thread she'd needed, a communications sergeant in the signal detachment supporting the 3rd Special Operations Group. Someone with access to planning systems and coordination channels. Someone whose bank records showed payments that didn't match his rank, funneled through accounts a smarter man might have hidden better. Staff Sergeant Damon Rourke. She memorized his face, his habits, his off-post address, even his family. And now she was here, positioned as a liaison officer for interagency coordination, with direct access to the exact people and systems she needed to build a case strong enough for the CI agent waiting to take whatever she uncovered. For them, for the 4 names etched into her ribs like a vow she would honor until her final breath. Staff Sergeant Nolan Creed wasn't a bad soldier, and that was exactly what made him dangerous. He had served 11 years in the Army, 7 of those with the 3rd Special Operations Group, climbing from a junior communications sergeant on an ODA to his current role inside the group's operations shop. He deployed to Khorasan 3 times and to the Red Frontier once, earned a Bronze Star with Valor for clearing a hostile compound under fire, and built a reputation as the kind of man who delivered results even when everything turned ugly. His evaluations were solid, his technical skills unquestionable, and the officers above him trusted his judgment. But Nolan Creed carried a wound no medic could patch, buried so deep in his identity he no longer recognized it as a wound at all. His father had been a command sergeant major. His grandfather had been a command sergeant major. 3 generations of Creed men had worn the uniform with distinction, each one drilling into him that rank was earned only through time, suffering, and paying dues in exactly the order tradition demanded. Nolan was 33 now, already passed over for Sergeant First Class once in favor of someone with fewer deployments but a graduate degree and better test scores. That rejection hardened something inside him, fueling the belief that the Army was shifting into something that no longer valued what he had bled for. And now Colonel Everett Hale had added a new task to his plate, helping integrate liaison personnel attached to the group for various coordination initiatives, including this woman. He stood in the briefing room with 4 other NCOs and 2 junior officers, waiting for the morning update. The coffee in his cup tasted bitter, and irritation still simmered as he replayed the image of the woman he had shoved aside at the gate, her drink splattering across the concrete like she'd never learned how to hold on to anything important. The door opened and Colonel Hale stepped in with the S3 operations officer beside him. Behind them came the woman from the checkpoint. She wore a duty uniform now, the coffee incident invisible, her presence somehow altered in a way Nolan couldn't immediately define, straighter, more composed, like she'd finally stopped pretending to be smaller than she really was. Colonel Hale addressed the room without ceremony, informing them that Captain Raina Calloway would be assigned to the 3rd Special Operations Group for the next 60 days as part of an interagency coordination review. She'd be working primarily with the S3 shop and the signal detachment, examining communication protocols and information sharing procedures between JSOC elements and conventional units. The silence that followed carried its own gravity. Nolan felt his jaw clench. A captain, an intelligence officer, and a woman, embedded within special operations to scrutinize procedures forged through selection, the Q course, and years spent in places she had likely only seen in sanitized briefings. He didn't try to hide his reaction. His exhale came loud enough to draw glances, deliberate enough to make his opinion known without saying anything that could be written down. Captain Calloway's eyes shifted to him and stayed there. Pale green. Completely empty. No irritation, no challenge, not even the defensiveness he had expected, just quiet analysis, as if she were filing him away for later and finding nothing remarkable. She spoke without raising her voice, simply mentioning that she recognized him from the gate that morning and noting, almost casually, that he had a unique approach to greeting fellow service members. A few people shifted in their seats, the discomfort obvious. Nolan Creed felt heat crawl up his neck as he muttered that he couldn't have known her status when she showed up dressed like a civilian, wandering near a checkpoint during the morning rush. Captain Raina Calloway didn't bother arguing. She just turned her attention back to Colonel Everett Hale as if Creed no longer existed, as if his words were too insignificant to acknowledge. It wasn't anger, it was pure dismissal, effortless and absolute. And in that moment, something in Creed's chest hardened into a sense of righteous purpose. He had no idea who she thought she was or what strings had placed her here, but he knew one thing with total certainty: he would figure out exactly what she was made of. The testing started that afternoon during a standard readiness evaluation he was helping to administer. Physical fitness in the morning, land navigation in the training area in the afternoon, routine for anyone attached to group operations. He didn't tamper with coordinates or alter standards, nothing anyone could call sabotage. But he made sure Captain Calloway got the toughest navigation route, the one that cut through thick drainage channels and dense vegetation along the eastern boundary, the route that regularly crushed soldiers who underestimated what the redstone terrain could do to the unprepared. She finished in the top 5. Not first, not outperforming operators who'd lived on that ground for years, but 5th out of 23. Her navigation was exact, her pace steady, and when she crossed the finish line her breathing stayed controlled, her posture unchanged from when she started. Creed watched her hand in her scorecard, grab her gear, and walk toward the recovery area without so much as a glance at anyone who had been waiting for her to break. That night, he started making calls, contacts who owed him favors, people with access to files that weren't supposed to be easily reached. Captain Raina Calloway, service number, assignment history. The document he received was irritatingly thin, exactly what Colonel Hale had described: military intelligence officer, training posts, liaison roles, nothing noteworthy. Except several sections were flagged with access restrictions his sources couldn't explain, locked behind acronyms he didn't even recognize. The doubt rising in his chest got heavier. But so did his resolve, because if she had secrets guarded at that level, then she had weaknesses worth exploiting. And Nolan Creed had always excelled at finding weaknesses when he chose to. Her assigned room was 12 feet by 14, a bed, a desk, a wall locker, a window staring at the blank wall of another building 20 meters away. It was far more space than she'd had during the last 18 months of hunting, and the emptiness pressed against her like something with weight. Raina sat on the edge of the bed at 2000 hours, boots still on, hands resting on her knees, breathing slow and steady. The building was quiet except for the low hum of the heating system and the occasional footsteps of someone heading to the latrine. She knew she should sleep. Tomorrow would bring more evaluations, more subtle attempts to measure whether she belonged here, more silent judgment from men like Creed who viewed her presence as an insult to everything they believed they had earned. But sleep wasn't waiting behind her eyelids. When she closed her eyes, she saw the valley. The memory struck without warning and without mercy, just as it always did, the first crack of gunfire ripping down from the ridgeline above them, the immediate, brutal realization that they'd been compromised, the sound of Marcus Reyes calling contact while coordinating their response even as rounds tore dirt from the ground around them. She remembered the smell of cordite mixing with copper, and that sharp metallic taste of fear coating the back of her throat. She remembered Chen pressed beside her in the rocks, weapon up, voice steady, telling her to move while he laid down cover. She remembered the cold moment when she understood that Kowalski wasn't replying to radio calls, the sick certainty settling into her stomach before she ever saw his body. 3 hours of non-stop fighting in terrain that gave them nowhere to hide. 3 hours begging for extraction that kept getting delayed because there was no landing zone they could hold. 3 hours watching her team shrink one man at a time until only 4 of them were left alive, two too badly wounded to even stand. The face that haunted her most was Chen's, not the moment he died on the helicopter, but the moment right before. He looked at her and said something she couldn't hear over the chaos and the rotors, forcing her to lean in close. He told her it wasn't her fault. He told her that no matter what happened next, she had to remember they had all chosen this, and none of them would ever regret that choice. Then his fingers loosened around her hand, and his eyes emptied into nothing. She pressed her fingertips to her ribs where the 4 names were inked in letters so small no one would ever see them unless she chose to show them: Reyes, Chen, Kowalski, White Horse. For men who deserved more than a classified dead end and a medical separation that felt like punishment for asking the questions no one wanted answered. She had spent 2 years pulling the thread that led here, 2 years of patience that would have broken her if not for her father's lessons, for the quiet hours in observation posts, for understanding that some things could never be rushed no matter how much you wanted them to end. Staff Sergeant Damon Rourke was only 40 meters away in the Signal Detachment building, probably asleep beside his wife, probably dreaming the kind of dreams men had when they sold their brothers for money. She didn't hate him. Hate was too hot, too reckless, too likely to make her slip at a moment when she couldn't afford mistakes. What she felt was colder, more patient, the certainty that justice would come because she would bring it, that evidence would surface because she would uncover it, that the men who died in that valley would be avenged because she had promised them, and she did not break promises. She lived for them every day until this was finished, and she would live for them every day after. 18 days into her assignment, the field training exercise order dropped, delivered by Colonel Everett Hale in a briefing whose tone carried meanings she recognized instantly. USAC had mandated a full-spectrum tactical evaluation for all personnel involved in interagency coordination, 3 days of field scenarios measuring individual capability, team cohesion, and performance under continuous stress. Captain Raina Calloway would participate alongside ODA operators, proving whether liaison personnel could actually function in the environments they were supposed to understand. The cadre running it came from outside the third group, removing any chance of favoritism or tampering, but the real message beneath the paperwork was obvious. Someone wanted her tested where nothing could be softened. Someone wanted proof she didn't belong. She accepted the order without a flicker of concern, showing nothing anyone could interpret as fear or hesitation. Inside, something cold and familiar settled quietly into place. The part of her that had learned to operate in places built to break anyone unprepared settled comfortably into motion. Good. Let them test her. Let them watch. The exercise kicked off at 0400 on a Tuesday in the training complex south of the main installation, where 34 personnel assembled in full tactical kit, plate carriers, rucks weighted to the standard 60-pound load, M4 carbines, comms gear, and 3 days of supplies. The cadre overseeing the evaluation were NCOs from the Group Support Battalion and observer controllers from the Directorate of Training, men with no stake in politics and no reason to score anyone on anything but performance. The first phase was movement, 18 hours of cross-country navigation through terrain that rose and fell without mercy. Pine forest gave way to exposed ridgelines, then to swampy lowlands that sucked at boots, twisted ankles, and turned every step into a tug-of-war against mud determined to swallow gear and patience alike. No trails. No roads. No rest beyond the minimum allowed for hydration and foot checks. Raina moved through it the same way she had moved through every hardship since childhood. One step, then another, then another. The weight digging into her shoulders was familiar. The burn in her legs was familiar. The whisper in her mind offering reasons to slow down was familiar. And she ignored it exactly as she always had. Because somewhere on this base, Damon Rourke was living as though the blood of 4 dead men didn't stain every inch of his existence. And she refused to give anyone even a sliver of reason to doubt she belonged here. Day 2 shifted into tactical scenarios, small unit problems meant to test decision-making under pressure. Ambush reactions with blank fire and miles gear, casualty evacuation drills, comms failures forcing quick adaptation. She was assigned to a 4-person element with 3 soldiers she had never met, 2 senior specialists and a young private first class named Delgado, who watched her with thinly veiled skepticism. The first event was a simulated ambush during movement to an objective rally point. The cadre kicked it off with blank fire from hidden positions and smoke grenades that turned the pine forest into swirling chaos. Her element scattered into cover and began returning fire according to standard drills, but the scenario escalated fast, additional enemy positions activating, flanking fire hammering from the left, and a simulated IED cutting off their planned withdrawal route. Delgado started to freeze, his movements sharp and unsure, wasting rounds on targets he couldn't engage. The other 2 glanced at her, and she didn't hesitate. Her voice sliced through the noise without needing to shout, commands given in a calm, precise rhythm that demanded obedience. She directed suppressive fire to pin down the flank, spotted an alternate withdrawal path through a drainage channel the opposing force hadn't covered, and coordinated movement by bounds so at least one weapon stayed active at all times. 6 minutes later, they reached the rally point intact. Ammunition use stayed within limits. What had started as a near disaster turned into a clean disengagement. The cadre observer jotted down notes but watched her longer than usual, his gaze following her with someone recognizing exactly what he was seeing. Day 3 brought the Crucible, a 24-hour continuous operation with almost no sleep and rising complexity. Her element was tasked with recon on a simulated high-value compound, coordination with adjacent units, and prepping for a notional extraction while managing ROE constraints and local civilian patterns. 14 hours in, the cadre finally introduced the complication everyone had been expecting. One of the adjacent element members, played by a cadre NCO, went down as a simulated casualty during the approach to the final positions. The rules required a full real-world medical response, assessment, treatment according to TCCC protocols, prepping for evacuation, all while keeping the mission on track. Delgado looked at her, and the expression in his eyes wasn't skepticism anymore but something closer to desperate hope, the look of someone who had reached the limit of what he understood and was praying she hadn't. She made a choice right then that mattered more than she realized. She placed Delgado on security at their covered position, a task essential but tightly scoped, something he could handle without unraveling. Then she moved to the casualty and began treatment. Check responsiveness. Identify massive hemorrhage. Tourniquet on the simulated wound to the right thigh, high and tight. Time marked on the strap. Airway control, proper positioning, casualty card filled with the required details. Her hands moved through the steps with the fluid certainty of someone who had done this not in training lanes but under fire in places where a wrong guess meant watching someone die. The cadre NCO acting as the casualty watched her work, and his expression shifted, recognition, the unmistakable understanding of a man who had seen the real thing enough times to know when he was looking at it again, even in a controlled environment. The scenario wrapped up at 1900 on day 3. Her element completed every assigned task, handled the casualty correctly, and maintained discipline throughout the long, grinding operation. The senior evaluator gathered scorecards and delivered a concise hot wash before releasing them for recovery. His feedback was crisp and exact. Captain Raina Calloway had displayed outstanding tactical judgment, advanced proficiency in medical procedures, and leadership under pressure that outperformed what he normally saw from personnel in her role. He didn't know who she was or where she had learned what she clearly knew, but he recognized capability when he saw it, and he said so publicly in front of the 34 soldiers who had spent 3 days assuming she didn't belong. The formal after-action review convened at 0900 the next morning in the main briefing room at Group Headquarters. Everyone who had participated in the exercise gathered in the briefing room, along with senior leadership from the 3rd Group and the cadre who had overseen the evaluation. Colonel Everett Hale sat in the front row. Nolan Creed stood at the back wall, arms folded, watching with an expression that had grown harder to read over the past 3 days. The senior cadre evaluator, a sergeant major named Richardson, a man with 28 years in special operations and zero tolerance for politics or theater, delivered the overall assessment. Performance across the board had been mixed, some elements exceeded expectations, others revealed shortcomings needing further training. Nothing unusual for a serious evaluation. Then he shifted to individual performance, and the room fell completely still. He described one element that had faced every obstacle the scenario could produce: ambush, flanking maneuvers, blocked routes, a casualty late in the mission, and prolonged operations with almost no rest. He outlined how that element responded, the tactical calls made, the medical care rendered, and the leadership shown under conditions specifically built to induce failure. Then he identified the element leader, Captain Raina Calloway. He stated plainly that her performance matched the highest-tier operators he had encountered across nearly 3 decades of service. He noted that her TCCC execution wasn't just competent, it was instinctive, the kind of muscle memory that comes only from real casualties in real combat. He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. He explained that he had attempted to review Captain Calloway's full service record that morning to understand where she had gained skills far beyond what her official file indicated. He hadn't been able to access the relevant sections. What he found instead were security flags and access restrictions beyond anything he had seen in his career, compartmented information controlled by officers who answered directly to JSOC and beyond. He told the room he didn't know who Captain Calloway truly was or where she had served before this assignment, but he knew the unmistakable signature of someone who had operated at levels most soldiers would never witness. Her official role was liaison officer for interagency coordination, and that was what she would remain on paper. But anyone who still believed she was just a staff captain with a clipboard needed to rethink that assumption, and, maybe, rethink how they had treated a soldier who had clearly earned her place in ways they might never fully understand. The silence that followed was total. Nolan Creed felt something collapse inside him, the infrastructure of his assumptions breaking apart into pieces he knew he'd spend months sorting through. The woman he had shoved aside at the gate. The captain he had tried to undermine with difficult routes and physical evaluations. The outsider he dismissed as a political attachment with friends in high places rather than genuine ability. She hadn't answered his hostility with anger or protest. She simply performed so far above expectation that his doubts became irrelevant, exposing his assumptions for what they were, the insecure reflexes of a man who judged others by standards that had nothing to do with actual capability. The briefing wrapped up and soldiers filtered out in small clusters, their conversations quiet, their understanding of the woman who had walked among them for 3 weeks permanently altered. Nolan Creed approached her before she could leave, stopping at a distance that signaled respect rather than challenge. He told her he owed her an apology. He admitted he had built his assumptions on nothing but his own limits, and that he had been wrong. She studied him for a moment before answering. She told him she understood the instinct to defend what someone had earned, she carried that same instinct herself. But she said that instinct turned poisonous the moment it blinded a person to the allies standing beside them. She told him that 4 men had died because someone believed his judgment mattered more than the truth, and she hoped Creed would remember this moment the next time he met someone whose capabilities he couldn't verify at first glance. She didn't wait for a reply. She had work to finish, and Staff Sergeant Damon Rourke still didn't know his world was about to collapse. The evidence she needed took another 4 weeks to assemble, and when it was complete, she delivered everything to the CI agent waiting for it. Financial transfers routed through overseas accounts, communication logs tying him to hostile intelligence networks, and the specific data leak that compromised Operation Arclight Valley, the mission that had cost 4 American lives in mountains that officially did not exist. Staff Sergeant Damon Rourke was taken into custody by CI and FBI counterintelligence teams on a Tuesday morning, charged under UCMJ Article 106A for espionage and conspiracy. The investigation and prosecution would stretch on for years. The outcome never wavered. Raina watched the arrest from across the parking lot, dressed in civilian clothes, carrying nothing that linked her to the case. Her role would never be acknowledged. Her testimony sealed. Her name redacted. That was exactly how she preferred it. Justice didn't need recognition, only completion. 3 months later, she received orders for a new assignment with JSOC, a position training and evaluating candidates for programs she would never be allowed to describe. It wasn't a return to operational status. It was something different. A chance to make sure the soldiers who followed her were better prepared for the moments when everything went wrong and no one was coming. Before leaving Redstone Base, she stood alone in the early morning fog and pressed her fingers against her ribs one last time. Reyes. Chen. Kowalski. White Horse. For names she would carry until her last breath. For men whose deaths had finally been answered. She had kept her promise, for them.